to Out and Back. And I have a very, very special guest today, and James Edward Mills. And James is the founder of the Joy Trip Project. And I have known James for many years. And he was one of the very first Black people, Black person in the outdoor industry. He is very credible. And he has, again, been the founder of the Joy Trip Project. And James, welcome to the show.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to see you again. It's been way too long since we've had time to chat. So really looking forward to our conversations.
Great. Where are we with the Joy Trip Project? What have you got going on?
Sure. Well, just to give you an ounce of background on what the Joy Trip Project is, by profession, I'm a independent media producer and freelance journalist. And I have a specialty in outdoor recreation and environmental conservation, with a further specialty in covering issues of diversity, equity, inclusion in public land management and access to our wild and scenic spaces, particularly in our national parks. And the platform on social media was created in 2009. It is a podcast, a website, a social media platform for Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc. But more than anything else, I describe myself as a news gathering organization that covers the business, art, and culture of the sustainable active lifestyle. And from that, I generate stories about not exclusively people of color in the outdoors, but as a primary focus of much of the work that I do, I tell stories about the Black-brown experience as it pertains to nature, based on my own personal experience, but also on the lived experiences of dozens of people across the country and around the world that I've had the pleasure of interviewing, talking to, spending time with, and telling their stories. So, the Joy Trip Project is basically about, finding, happiness in the world outside and being able to enjoy the time that you spend in nature.
Well, recently there's been a lot of publicity and good publicity about the Black climbing group that summited Everest. And I'm sure you feel that is a real step forward with regard to Blacks engaging in the outdoor business. I mean, summiting Everest is difficult. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, to say the least. And I'm really excited to be able to talk about the work of the Full Circle Everest expedition that successfully made it to the summit of Mount Everest on May 12th, literally just over a week ago. And I had the pleasure of being part of the organization and planning of the expedition. And I walked in with the climbers from the debarkation point at the Lukla airport in Nepal, and we walked almost 30 miles up what I like to call the Himalaya Highway to Everest Base Camp, basically through the Khumbu Valley. And as a person who spent most of his career in the outdoors, in outdoor recreation in general, this was something that I've been hoping to see happen basically for my entire career. I mean, growing up, there weren't many, if any, Black mountaineers in my personal experience. There were very few, and I can literally count them on the fingers of one hand, of African Americans, Black Americans in outdoor recreation as a profession. And it's literally been over the last 30 years of my career working with a wide variety of different organizations around the country, every organization from the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, the Sierra Club, organizations like the National Outdoor Leadership School, and others. It's taken kind of a wellspring of enthusiasm and support to not only find and train a group of Black climbers, but to provide them with the financial resources and the logistical resources that they need in order to be successful. And under the leadership of my friend, Philip Henderson, who is a NOLS instructor, but also a lifelong advocate of outdoor recreation, he led an amazing team of 10 climbers that were able to put 7 climbers successfully on the summit. And what this ultimately does is that it kind of changes the paradigm with regard to, you know, what Black people in outdoor recreation do and don't do. And up until this expedition, prior to this, there had only been 7 Black people to make it to the 6 Black people to make it to the summit of Everest. Only 1 was an American, and there had prior to this yet to be a Black American man to make it to the summit of Everest. The first Black American was a woman, my friend Sophia Dannenberg, who summited Everest in 2006. And since then, there have been Black people from other parts of the world, from France, from Jamaica, from South Africa, but there had never been a Black American. And this is actually a profound shift in terms of not only levels and degrees of participation among who is climbing high mountains in the Himalaya, but it literally doubled the number of Black people who had been on the summit of Everest overnight. And what that ultimately means is that we now have a cadre of heroes who can go back into their respective communities and be emblematic of people who can successfully do something that fewer than 11,000 people in the world have ever done. And now we can begin a bigger, deeper conversation about other things that people of color in outdoor recreation have yet to do. And that includes not just climbing mountains and ascending rivers and, you know, traversing long distance hiking trails. It also includes starting businesses, leading major companies, becoming competent journalists, hopefully like myself, or to become filmmakers or artists. I mean, we're seeing a really fantastic surge of representation in the outdoor industry that we haven't seen before. And I'm really happy to witness it, and I'm really happy to report about it on the Joycher Project.
You had mentioned that this was a paradigm shift. Do you think that the climbing group realizes that?
Oh, absolutely. You know, because frankly, these are the things that we talked about. You know, and one of the reasons why many of the people on this expedition wanted to do this project in the first place. You know, part of it is all of us, and I can say that without hesitation, have experienced being the one Black person on a camping trip or on a climbing trip or at a ski resort. And we realized personally that there has been a very profound lack of participation and representation in these sports. And I think that each one of us, you know, wanted to help to change that, you know, to literally create a shift in the face of outdoor recreation by having people who have not only the interest and inclination, but also the skill and expertise to do these activities authentically. You know, so a lot of people might suggest that things like this are simply window dressing, or that they are done for the sake of, you know, what's described as affirmative action, you know, or, you know, just to, you know, make a statement for, you know, the woke generation. You know, but the reality is that, you know, we need to be able to create visible representation so that young people can see that these things are possible, you know, so that they can see themselves as part of a dynamic, exciting, and, you know, really rewarding industry that hopefully will create a new generation of people who will become environmental stewards, you know, who will help to protect our natural resources for generations yet to come. So yes, I definitely think, because again, these are things that we talked about, that one of the reasons why we wanted to see this paradigm shift is so that we can have better representation, so that more people of color will see themselves in the outdoors. Got
it. So I want to go backwards now. You, I said, it was white guys.
Yeah.
And then it became white women. Okay. And the issue here is, when you first got into the outdoor business, did you feel lonely, or what were your feelings about being the only Black guy in the outdoor industry?
Well, I mean, it's fair to say that I was one of very few. So let's not say that I was the only Black guy in the outdoor industry. But having said that, yes, there weren't very many of us, and the reasons why are vast and they're varied, and for the purposes of this conversation, just to kind of help to put all this in context, we can take a look at the cultural racial disparities of Black and white America going back 180 years to the end of the Civil War. But we don't need to go all the way back to slavery, to look at how we've made these profound shifts. One of the things that we need to realize is that what we describe as wild and scenic places, or places for outdoor recreation, were racially segregated from the day they were created the National Park Service was created in 1916, all the way up through the end of the Second World War. Okay, so it wasn't a question as to whether or not Black people.
Those were all segregated. They were segregated through World War II.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's not something that's widely known or even talked about. I mean, and if you take a look at when Woodrow Wilson signed the legislation to create the National Park Service, it was a federal agency that was to be segregated along with every other aspect of the federal government. Back then, it included the armed forces, and so not unlike the segregation that exists during World War II, and including World War I, World War II, I mean, all of the major conflicts, we had a racially segregated army. The same thing was actually true of federal service in public land management, and that included our national parks. And so that our national parks also, in terms of visitation, were, and especially depending on the communities that they were in, especially if we're talking about the South, for example, national parks like Shenandoah, for example, were racially segregated. If there was to be allowed some degree of racial integration, the parks had designated campsites and drinking fountains and restrooms and everything else that you would expect as part of civil society. And it really wasn't until 1945, oddly enough, under the aegis of Eleanor Roosevelt, who wanted to be able to provide outdoor recreation as one of the many benefits of returning Black veterans from the Second World War. And it's only then that you get the opening of national parks under the aegis of then Secretary of the Interior, Harold Eckes. And then we start seeing a gradual increase in the number of people of color who are spending time in our national parks. In fact, Yosemite was formally desegregated in 1952. My parents got married in 1953, and they honeymooned in Yosemite. Okay, and so my own family heritage includes very early representation in outdoor recreation. So I have that to look back on, because my parents, at the time, affluent, African-American, educated people, wanted the best for their family. That included summer vacations, camping in national parks, winter vacations, skiing in ski resorts that would allow them to recreate there at the time. So in big answer to your question, segregation in public land today, or rather lack of representation in public land today, is a direct reflection of the deliberate efforts to segregate public land management going back to the very beginning. And so especially as we're talking about the beginning of the civil rights movement, there are so many other things that we're struggling to achieve. Whether we're talking about housing discrimination or access to healthcare, or being able to get an education, or where you can live, work, or play. Outdoor recreation wasn't the most popular job description that a person could apply for. But also there's the whole notion of the relative safety of natural wooded areas with the very real threat or risk of racially motivated violence.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you might be familiar with the Green Book. You know, it's a popular film based on a very real document that from the 1930s to the 1960s was a detailed list of all the places where a person of color could travel safely in the United States. It showed where the restaurants were, where the campsites were, where you can get a haircut or get your nails done or whatever. But they set that up mainly because people of color could count on being racially discriminated in areas that they would travel to as they were driving across the country. You know, and so there are a lot of blocks in the way that you know created this disparity that we're seeing right now. And I was fortunate, you know, because of who my parents were and what their priorities were at a very early age to believe and to embrace the fact that this is something that I was entitled to. That spending time in the outdoors was something that I could enjoy and embrace just as an expression of my own humanity. Not everyone in my community, not everyone else in the country had that same privilege or opportunity. And it's really only been in the last generation or two that we're seeing that happen more. And that shift is starting to change. And everything that we're seeing now is a reflection of that, including the first all-Black expedition to the summit of Mount Everest.
Yeah, and what's really interesting to me is to listen to you here is that my impression had been well before the summit of Everest, is that many times the Black community, it was more of a cultural thing, is that the outdoors wasn't of interest to that community. And now I'm seeing a shift where I'm seeing black folks really now having an interest in the outdoors. Talk about that a little bit. Why has that shift happened? Because that seems to be more organic.
Right. Well, you know, I mean, and I will actually go so far to say that a bit of it is deliberate because I've actually been advocating for this for almost 20 years now professionally. Yeah. You know, when we stop and think about how that shift ultimately occurs, you know, yes, indeed, there is a cultural priority for what can only be described as urbanization, you know, but you have to ask yourself, why is that? I mean, especially, you know, when you have, you know, people of African descent coming from you know, from very natural areas on the continent, people of African American descent living in rural areas in the South and migrating to farming communities in the North. Part of the problem is that we have basically compulsory urbanization, you know, so that if you take a look at how many communities are established based on housing, it's important to understand that, you know, thanks to a practice called redlining, there are places in this country where, as a Black person, I could not purchase a house. Okay, and that includes the house I live in right now. You know, I live in what was a racially segregated neighborhood that there's literal language in the deeds of homes, and it's still in many cases the language is still there that this home shall not be sold to anyone other than of the white race. Mm-hmm. And so no, I mean, you can have a Black person with all the money in the world, but they would never be able to purchase a home in a suburb. You know, that they would never be able to purchase a home in a resort town. You know, they would never be able to, you know, have recreational property outside of an urban area. So what do? You focus your time and your attention and your energy where you can, and that's going to be in the cities. Mm-hmm. Okay? It's going to be on the basketball courts. Okay? It's going to be on the football fields. You know, and oddly enough, but it's not going to be in swimming pools. Yeah. You know, it's not going to be in ski resorts. It's not going to be on polo fields. You know, because there's very clear racial segregation in terms of what people are enabled to do based on where they can and can't live. And so that's where the culture comes in. So the cultural identity is based upon an urban model, and your cultural identity becomes wrapped up in your music. It comes wrapped up in the foods you eat, the places that you do and go for fun. And it also comes to mind in terms of what cultural authenticity is. If Black people aren't allowed to camp, the presumption is that Black people don't camp. But you have to ask yourself why. Okay, if Black people don't ski, it's not a question of whether they can or can't ski. The question is, are they given the opportunity to? Black people why can't Black people swim? And we have these cultural identities that tell us that there are things that Black people don't do. And unfortunately, there then becomes a bit of negative cultural feedback that within your community, a Black person is basically told that because this is not something that we do as a people, if you want to be authentically Black, you won't either.
Yeah.
Okay, because you then get accused of acting white. Okay, so, that you're trying to live above the place that you were raised. And that's one of the reasons why we have these cultural disparities. They're designed to be that way.
So what's changing? Because it seems to me that this is going, in my view and in your view, the right way. I'm seeing more Black folks in Park City. I ski a lot. I'm seeing a lot of that. I'll give you a story. 15 years ago, we had a Black ski group that came to Park City.
National Brotherhood of Skiers.
Yeah, nobody knew what to expect. Okay. But we had thousands of Black skiers in Park City, and they had the greatest time. And we couldn't wait for them to get back because they brought a whole new vibe to the whole thing. Now, that was a cultural thing, right, but they weren't dressed in Patagonia when they went out. They were dressed up more than just Patagonia. They didn't care that they didn't fit into the outdoor industry. They were in sport coats and the women looked great and they were going out to dinner. It was great. So my question is, there seems to be a natural organic, migration now for the outdoors, realizing that in the past there have been barriers, but now they seem to be falling quickly. Do you agree?
I do agree. And there's a couple of things that are happening. Number one, Black liberation now includes infinitely more opportunities for social mobility. So you now have Black people with disposable income and leisure time. And that in and of itself is a liberating factor right there. And also, you have a certain amount of, internalized racism in the white community that's starting to fall away too. And so that they're not putting up as many barriers to access deliberately, and it ultimately boils down to, time and money, and if you are running a ski resort in Park City, Utah, you're not going to take the time to dissuade a paying customer, nope, regardless of the color of their skin, to visit your resort. So that's one of the biggest things that has changed. What's most significant, and the reason why we're seeing more of this, is because of things like social media. We have more opportunities to see things like this. They were happening before. I mean, my parents had a house in Deer Valley for 30 years. Okay, my brothers and sisters and I used to ski there every winter. We were among those people that you saw at the National Brotherhood of Skiers Summit.
Yeah.
But we didn't have those pictures on our phone. Okay, we didn't have. No one had cameras back then. But now we do. So now we are seeing better representation than ever before, and people are seeing themselves and they're saying, "Wow, that looks cool. They look like they're having a good time. I'd like to have that kind of experience too. I didn't know that I could do things like that." That's what's changing. What's really changing is there's more cultural, social acceptance of this activity so that more people are inclined to do it.
So last question. What's your hope for the future? You've been working on this, and I know you've been working on this for over 20 years, and you've been talking about this. Your passion still, after 20 years, comes through. And, you know, there's progress now. What is your hope for the future? What is your insight there?
Well, I mean, my biggest hope is that what we're experiencing right now isn't exclusively window dressing. The level of representation has never been better, but representation isn't enough. We can't just have Black people on the covers of magazines. We can't just have them in films and as models because exclusively because they look good. We need to have people of color across every spectrum of our society and culture to assume some degree of agency so that they're running companies, so that they are becoming owners of their own businesses, so that they're opening their own ski resorts, so that they're not just wearing Patagonia, they're creating a brand that is competing with Patagonia, to create a variety of different types of style and creative expression and technical innovation. That to me is the real future, so that, you have people of color not being integrated into the existing outdoor industry, but are actually being able to contribute to it, okay, to add our culture and our innovation to the industry so that, we're not just on the periphery and the margins, we're actually now in the center, and we'll have the ability to lift up the industry as a whole. Because, if we have the ability to create opportunities for those on the margins of our society, that means that there'll be infinitely more people in the middle of our society so that everything can grow, and so, I imagine a day when this conversation that we're having right now is quaint, so that we're thinking about this nostalgically as, gosh, remember back when this when this is a big problem and we struggled with how we're going to get better representation in the outdoor industry. Aren't you glad that that we made this change? So that not unlike having a Black president, we would like to have a Black president of the North Face. We would like to have a ski team that has more Black members on it, that we have, representation of all aspects of human endeavor that is reflective of the society as a whole, so that if, let's say there's the Black population currently represents 13% of the population, well, it should represent 13% of participants in outdoor recreation, because there is no marginal difference, relative to rates of participation. Everybody is invited and welcome and encouraged to not only participate, but to thrive in these environments.
Well, let's leave it there. That is a great way to wrap this up. James Edward Mills, thank you for your time at the Joy Trip Project. I appreciate you being our guest on Out and Back, and I look forward to seeing you in the very near future.
I look forward to it. Paul, thank you very much for allowing me to talk to you, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Hopefully at the Outdoor Retailer Show coming up next month.
Thank you, sir. Talk to you.
You bet.